Combating anti-Semitism wherever it emerges is a vital part of what B'nai B'rith does around the world. We'll never give up on trying to eradicate the scourge, and we are ever vigilant. Well, just 2 months ago, America and the world lost an important statesman in former Secretary of State Colin Powell. It was Powell who in 2004 stood before the landmark Berlin Conference on Anti-Semitism, hosted by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and he declared, "Political disagreements do not justify physical assaults against Jews in our streets, the destruction of Jewish schools, or the desecration of synagogues and cemeteries. There is no justification for anti-Semitism." And he continued, "It is not anti-Semitic to criticize the state of Israel, but the line is crossed when Israel or its leaders are demonized or vilified, for example, by the use of Nazi symbols and racist caricatures." During the global pandemic, we have become accustomed to a trove of conspiracy theories and unfounded allegations directed at the Jewish people and the Jewish state, fueled by primitive anti-Semitism and aided by modern means of communication, such as social media. But when Hamas initiated hostilities against Israel this year, and a wave of anti-Jewish attacks inevitably resulted, the new peaks of anti-Semitism we reached intensified our community's anguish and heightened the urgent need for strategies to combat the problem. While it is certainly the case that anti-Semitism may resemble other hatreds in some respects, hatred of Jews is unique in its longevity, its persistence, and in its multifaceted nature. The complexity of this social illness reflects the collective identity of Jews as both an ethnic and a religious group, and as a global community. Thus, to understand anti-Semitism in all its modern dimensions, one must recognize the various manifestations of the problem: the physical attacks and threats, the online hate speech, the restrictions on religious freedom, Holocaust denial, the BDS movement, and assaults on the state of Israel that go beyond mere policy criticism. These varied forms of anti-Semitism, which originate on the far right, the far left, and among Islamic extremists, all require our urgent attention. The OSCE Berlin Conference that Secretary Powell addressed in 2004 followed several years of slow response by European officials to the worsening state of anti-Semitism on that continent. Anti-Semitic violence was merely a reaction to political events, some of them calmly reasoned. When hostilities in the Middle East subsided, attacks against Jews in Europe would as well. There was also confusion about the nature of a problem that defied easy categorization. Is anti-Semitism a religious freedom issue? Is it a racial issue? Is it a political issue? Unfortunately, the problem was often defined in ways that suggested an unwillingness to seriously tackle it head on. We are against a hierarchy of discrimination, some officials said. In other words, if anti-Semitism is bad, then we're against it, because we're against all bad things. We'll treat all social maladies with the same remedies. The red line that Secretary Powell drew back then led over time to a consortium of countries committed to Holocaust education and remembrance, now known as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, known by its acronym, IRA, to adopt a working definition of anti-Semitism in 2016, only 5 years ago. The IRA definition was not intended to be a detailed, deep dive into the causes and manifestations of this millennia-old hatred. It was meant rather to speak to categories of Jew hatred, both classic and contemporary. The working definition's recognition of how the existence of Israel has worked its way into the repertoire of anti-Semites has been vitally important in helping those fighting anti-Semitism to pull the veil off, quote unquote, legitimate criticism of Israel from those who advocate the elimination of the Jewish state. Anti-Semitism includes, quote, accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, close quote. It's also, quote, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interest of their own nations, close quote. Or, as we see almost every day somewhere in the world, quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of Israel is a racist endeavor. To date, More than 30 countries have adopted the IRA working definition, and the number of countries continues to grow. Regional and local governments are doing the same, as are organizations as diverse as the Argentine Football Federation and the Global Imams Council. As anti-Semitic incidents continue to mount, the need for awareness of anti-Semitism's real-life manifestations and impact becomes even more apparent. The IRA definition is an important tool for education and guidance. Governments and civil society must continue to use it. Similarly, IRA's 2013 working definition on Holocaust denial and distortion should gain wider usage. Anti-Semitism continues to propel Holocaust denial in an effort to recast the history of the Holocaust so as to make anti-Semitism more acceptable, and depict the Holocaust as a Jewish ploy in the service of nefarious goals. And while Holocaust denial grows, a dwindling number of survivors are reaching the end of their lives. Recent studies reveal an astonishing lack of knowledge about the Holocaust among millennials and Generation Zers, which obligates us to expand Holocaust education programs in our schools and our universities. As the need for practical tools becomes more apparent, a new handbook of definitions has emerged, one that figures to play an important role. IRA, in conjunction with the European Commission and the support of the German government, has published a new guide. Based on extensive research conducted by the German Federal Association of Departments for Research and Information on Anti-Semitism, the handbook is a first-of-its-kind best practices guide for use in such fields as law enforcement, the judiciary, education, international bodies, funding institutions, and civil society. The handbook connects the IRA document to real-life examples, which help to make it a real working definition. Showing the relevance of the battle against anti-Semitism to individual branches of government or to educators will help to monitor, identify, and counteract anti-Semitism in the open or in the dark corners of society across the European continent and beyond. As more countries, state and local governments, agencies, and non-governmental organizations adopt and implement the IRA working definition, the questions of how the definition will be applied and by whom loom large. And this is where the handbook comes in. Expressions of anti-Semitism know no borders. The hierarchy of leadership in Iran regularly spews anti-Semitism, often using Nazi imagery. Israel is frequently referred to as a cancer that needs to be excised. Genocidal calls for Israel's destruction are daily features in the Iranian media. And Tehran is known for its, quote, leadership in the Holocaust denial arena. Since the pandemic has settled in Europe, we've witnessed a concerted campaign by the neo-fascist Nordic resistance movement to intimidate Jews in their places of worship and communal spaces. A kosher restaurant in France, the scene of countless acts of anti-Semitism, was vandalized with tags of "Hitler was right," "Jews get out," and "Free Palestine." In Greece, multiple cemeteries were vandalized. Rabbis were attacked on the streets of Berlin and Vienna. And in Germany, on the holiday of Sukkot, a synagogue was attacked in Hamburg just days before the one-year commemoration of the Yom Kippur attack on another synagogue in Germany, in Halle. And earlier this year, the European Court of Justice ruled that the European Union member states can legislate against kosher ritual slaughter, or shechita. Already, some countries place restrictions tantamount to a ban on that practice, including Sweden, Denmark, Finland, regions of Belgium, and non-EU member Switzerland. Efforts to ban circumcision, or Brit Milah, have been similarly underway in Europe for some time, though without much success to this point. Denying Jews the right to these essential acts of religious freedom, especially on European soil, where the greatest crimes against the Jewish people were perpetrated, is not just discriminatory. Here in the United States, the problem of anti-Semitism has become strikingly apparent as shootings in Pittsburgh, San Diego, New York, and New Jersey in the past several years have left American Jewry shaken and fearful for its safety. The responsibility of governments, international organizations, and leaders of society to confront this phenomenon is becoming increasingly urgent. Also of concern today is the mainstreaming of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel discourse, as reflected in occasional comments by athletes, entertainers, and politicians. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of Detroit, for example, recently spun an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about economic exploitation when she said, and I quote, "If you open the curtain and look behind the curtain, it's the same people that make money, and yes, they do, off the racism, off these broken policies. There is someone there making money. They do it from Gaza to Detroit, and it's a way to control people, to oppress people, and it's those structures that we continue to fight against," close quote. Today, Jews are by far the religious group most victimized by hate crimes in this country. President Biden has said that the neo-Nazi and white supremacist march in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 was his primary inspiration for running for president. He's also said that he wants to develop a comprehensive approach to fighting anti-Semitism in consultation with the Jewish community. One thing this is likely to mean is the restoration of programs tracking right-wing domestic terrorists. B'nai B'rith has supported legislation known as the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that would recognize Jews as a protected class deserving of civil rights protections, but the bill has never passed. President Trump in 2019, however, did sign an executive order that achieves the bill's aims. The order uses the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism as a standard for determining whether anti-Semitism has taken place on university campuses, and we know that this happens on campuses all over the country. The Education Department has subsequently used the working definition to investigate some extreme anti-Israel activity on campus, but some civil liberties groups have objected to this practice with a view toward protecting anti-Israel speech. The Biden administration has announced its intention to codify the executive order, and we hope that that will soon be accomplished. One important means of combating anti-Semitism is education against bigotry and education about the Holocaust. B'nai B'rith has worked hard to help secure passage of the Never Again Education Act, which expands the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's educational programming. The law authorizes the museum to develop and disseminate educational materials about the Holocaust to be used as accessible resources for teachers across the United States. Conversely, there is a disturbing trend occurring in public and university education, particularly in California, where schools are adopting critical ethnic studies curricula that negatively portray Jews and Israel, with the latter being vilified as a colonial occupier and apartheid state. B'nai B'rith has also participated in joint efforts to demand accountability from educators and officials on this issue. In one case, California Governor Gavin Newsom responded to such a campaign by vetoing a bill to mandate a course in ethnic studies as a high school graduation requirement. Developments that place Jews in an other or outcast category, which is unacceptable, can be read and only as anti-Semitic. Unless some think anti-Semites cannot bring back classic blood libel charges against Jews from the Middle Ages, the Cantor Center at Tel Aviv University reported last summer that there were widespread assertions that Israel or Jews as a whole were responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic. In the early stages of the pandemic, websites charged Israel with creating the virus in order to manufacture vaccines for it, from which it would profit. With reports indicating a continuing rise in anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses, an arsonist set fire to the University of Delaware's Chabad Center just as the school year opened last fall. In January, among those demonstrators storming the US Capitol were those wearing clothing adorned with Nazi imagery, including a Camp Auschwitz hoodie. Much anti-Semitism from the far left focuses on Israel and Zionism, with comparisons to apartheid South Africa and condemnations of the, quote, occupation. From the extreme right, classic charges of control of the media and banks are rolled out in new 21st century rappers, but their message of hate remains the same. And notwithstanding the much welcomed rapprochement between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors, mainly in the Arab and Islamist media particularly, but not limited to the Palestinian media, spin webs of anti-Semitic rhetoric on a daily basis. The common denominator to all of this is hatred of Jews. In our community, there are many whose innate antennae can identify anti-Semitism from the proverbial 36,000 feet, but others are less likely to recognize the nuances of when it appears. And so the IRA handbook will be a vital resource for them. The working definition and the new IRA handbook are not cures for history's oldest social virus. much more needs to be done. On the internet, which has had a multiplier effect, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and outright rants run rampant on our laptops and our tablets. The major social media platforms must confront the role they are playing as enablers of such combustible language. In the 21st century, combating anti-Semitism requires new tools and means to join the battle. The IRA Handbook is a welcome addition to the resources we need to get the job done. But if it sits on the shelf, it will have been a noble but a wasted effort. We need to encourage its wide distribution and be especially an advocate for its recommendations and practices to be put to good use. While we've seen some positive developments from IRA and the European Union, the United Nations, surprisingly, has also produced a little bit of good news. As UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion, Ahmed Shahid, has issued a first-time dedicated report on global anti-Semitism, and he's been working on a follow-up. Meanwhile, the UN has released a plan of action to safeguard religious sites, as well as a strategy and plan of action on hate speech, both specifically noting anti-Semitism among trends of particular concern. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has designated Miguel Moratinos, a former Spanish foreign minister, as who now serves as the High Representative for the UN Alliance of Civilizations, as his focal point to monitor anti-Semitism and enhance a system-wide response. He's condemned anti-Semitic attacks and has convened Jewish organizations, including B'nai B'rith, for consultations on further action. Israel continues to be the only country scrutinized and condemned under a dedicated, permanent agenda item at the UN Human Rights Council. Meanwhile, the Palestinians have tried to placate critics of this reality by merely merging some anti-Israel resolutions at the Council and elsewhere, shifting some to other items while making certain that measures even more vociferously hostile to Israel are adopted. The UN Human Rights Council now has, for the first time, a new open-ended commission of inquiry, scrutinizing Israel's self-defense efforts against Hamas, and a blacklist stigmatizing companies doing business with Israelis or Israel in the West Bank. The Commission of Inquiry was voted upon during the Council's 30th special session. Nearly 1/3 of all the special sessions in the Council's history have dealt with Israel, in addition to all of the biased special attention already heaped on Israel in Geneva. As with previous special sessions, scant attention was paid to the terrorist groups who initiate conflict and endanger civilians on both sides of the border. Rather, the spotlight focused only on legitimate Israeli countermeasures. The commission will be chaired by UN former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, an official whose record of constantly bashing Israel was no doubt the reason that she was given the, quote, honor of chairing this new group. The blacklist, which was first published last year, is made up almost exclusively of Israeli companies and can now serve as a clearinghouse for information for BDS campaigns. Needless to say, no other conflict situation has a similar list. The Human Rights Council doesn't have the decision-making power to interfere in business matters, nor does the Human Rights Commissioner have the competence to create such a list. But at the UN, rules and precedents routinely get thrown out the window in a rush to attack Israel. Similar to the Human Rights Council special session, the UN General Assembly resumed its 10th emergency session, special sessions, which allow the world body to hold extraordinary and extraordinarily punitive meetings on Israel. Of course, no other conflict has such a session devoted to it. The 10th session never ends. It merely is suspended and reactivated when member states have a reason to use Israel as a punching bag. At these gatherings, the true reality of the conflict rarely is shared by delegates, most of whom use their time to bash Israel. The word Hamas is seldom uttered. At one such meeting, the UN Secretary General said that children in Gaza were living in, quote, hell on earth, ignoring who is really responsible for the misery in the territory. Hamas, which builds terrorist infrastructure amidst a civilian population, while Israel exercises remarkable restraint and response. The Secretary General's characterization of the conflict also evinced little sympathy for children in Sderot, Ashkelon, and throughout Israel, who had spent days and nights running to or sleeping in shelters and were terrorized by thousands of volleys of Hamas rockets. The UN, both at the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, despite some member state opposition, continues to reaffirm the 2001 Durban Declaration, which singled out Israel alone for implied characterization as racist. Entities within the UN bureaucracy itself, including the Division for Palestinian Rights, the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, and the Special Committee to Investigate Israeli Practices, continue to spend millions of dollars a year to advance the Palestinians' political goals and narrative worldwide, including advocacy for a Palestinian-claimed right of return that threatens Israel's very existence. Specialized bodies like the Commission on the Status of Women and the World Health Assembly continue to ritually single out Israel alone for obscene condemnation. The Palestinians, deemed an observer state at the UN, continue to be the beneficiary of the body's only dedicated day of solidarity with a particular people. On that occasion and on others, UN leaders have bemoaned only alleged Israeli violations of Palestinian rights, the impact on the Palestinians' economy of Israeli defensive measures, but not the Palestinian actions which necessitate Israel's responses and alleged violence by Israeli Jewish settlers. In turn, the UN falsely dubbed LEK, an Israeli recently murdered in Jerusalem, as a settler. The UN was found in its ongoing accounting of conflict casualties to make fabricated distinctions between civilian settlers and other Israeli civilians killed by Palestinian terrorists who are rarely condemned or even recognized as such. The UN Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, continues to be complicit in spreading anti-Israel incitement among Palestinians. More broadly, the agency perpetuates the Palestinian refugee issue as an obstacle to serious, meaningful peacemaking. Events at the world body and around the world underscore the urgency of continuing the fight against anti-Semitism in all its manifestations. And with that, you can be assured that B'nai B'rith will continue to be among the leaders in the fight against anti-Semitism here at home and abroad. Please visit our None Shall Be Afraid page on our website to learn more about our activities in that regard. Our Washington, New York, European Union, and B'nai B'rith offices and advocates around the world work tirelessly on a wide front to promote programs and initiatives aimed at countering and turning back Jew hatred. Be sure to look through our catalog of podcasts, video conversations, and webinars for informative discussions with leading experts about anti-Semitism. And be sure to visit and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for comment on breaking news and incidents of anti-Semitism globally. As I look back on Secretary Powell's Berlin speech 17 years ago and the surge in anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and related hatreds we have witnessed since then, I feel the kind of moral clarity that Powell offered then is needed even more now. We must commit ourselves to the resolute defiance against hatred that animated the Berlin Conference in 2004. As Powell said, let tolerance be our legacy. May future generations of school children read that in the early decades of the 21st century, humankind finally consigned anti-Semitism to history, never to darken the world again. Thank you.